We will begin our presentation by stating upfront the objectives of this training session, which are twofold. First, to provide participants with the information and tools necessary to facilitate compliance with the natural health product GMPs. And second, to assist participants in the interpretation and implementation with the GMP requirements. Let's begin with a working definition of the GMPs. The GMPs are a set of minimum mandatory standards and practices intended to ensure that every NHP will consistently meet its marketing authorization and will be fit for its intended purpose. Note the word minimum in this definition. The GMPs are not the ideal. Often, companies claim they manufacture their products to the highest quality standards, and this claim is often featured on their websites. However, when asked what is the standard, they say the Canadian NHP GMPs. Well, these are not the highest standards. The GMPs are the minimum standards that you are legally required to meet. Note also the word mandatory, which is underlined in the screen before you. The GMPs are not voluntary, they're required legally. And just to emphasize that point, let's look at the actual text of the regulations. Part 3, Section 43 of the NHP regulations state, "No person shall sell an NHP unless it's manufactured, packaged, labeled, recorded, distributed, and stored in accordance with this part, i.e., in accordance with the GMPs. The definition of sell as it's defined in the Food and Drugs Act means to offer for sale, expose for sale, to have in possession for sale, and to distribute even if no money changes hands. We mention these 2 points to dispel 2 common misconceptions. First, some believe that if a product meets specification, it can be released for sale. But as per Section 43, you must comply with all of the GMPs for the sale to be legal. Second, some believe that so long as the product hasn't left their premises, they cannot be held accountable under the GMPs. But as per definition of sell, if the product is just sitting on your warehouse floor, you're liable under the GMPs, even if there's no bill of sale. Some of the possible consequences of failing to comply include product or equipment seizure, embargoes, recalls, injunctions, stop sales, license denial or cancellation, and that can include product licenses or site licenses, prosecution fine and/or imprisonment. It may comfort you to note that we don't know of anyone who has actually been prosecuted or gone to prison under these regulations in Canada, but we do know of many cases where these other enforcement actions have occurred and are occurring as we speak. Now, the GMPs tend to be somewhat removed from our everyday experience. So, by way of continuing introduction, let's look at something that's perhaps more familiar, and use the Highway Traffic Act as an analogy to put the GMPs into perspective. So, just as we have the Food and Drugs Act, so in Ontario at least, we have the Highway Traffic Act. Ironically, the Highway Traffic Act says almost nothing about how to drive a car, just as the Food and Drugs Act says almost nothing about how to manufacture NHPs. Instead, the Act just lays down some general ordinances, which are then interpreted by the regulations. Acts and regulations tell you what you must do, or must not do. They do not tell you how to do it. For example, the Highway Traffic Act tells you to stop at a stop sign, but it doesn't tell you how to apply the brakes. The GMPs tell you that you must have a stability program in place, but doesn't tell you exactly how to implement such a system or what elements should be included. That's where the guidelines come in, i.e., the third layer in our pyramid that you see on the screen. In the case of GMPs, that would be the GMP guidance document, which is available on the NHPD website and should be downloaded and reviewed. In the case of the Highway Traffic Act, that would be the driver's handbook, which most of you are familiar with. It's that little book that you studied when you did your written test. If one were to look at that driver's handbook, it would say something like, when making a left turn, activate your indicator, advance into the intersection, and when oncoming traffic is clear, proceed to turn, etc. So let's say you memorize the rules of the road as laid out in the handbook, and then you go for your road test. While you're driving, the examiner says, you turned too fast, or you didn't fully brake at that stop. You say, "Show me in the regulations or even in the handbook where it says how fast you can accelerate or how hard you can brake." It doesn't. It's a matter of the examiner's interpretation. The same thing happens when you file a site license application or are audited by an inspector. You may think that you have all the GMPs covered, and then you get a deficiency notice or an audit observation saying it's not good enough. It's open to the interpretation of the reviewer or auditor who visits your site. This interpretation is often risk-based. A police officer, to go back to our analogy, who sees you going 5 kilometers an hour over the speed limit on an expressway will likely let it go. But if you're going 5 kilometers an hour above the speed limit in a school zone, you're likely looking at a ticket. The same sort of principle applies to the GMPs. We're therefore going to look at the GMPs mainly at this lower level of interpretation that you see on the pyramid on your screen. In doing so, we're going to follow the outline exactly as it's laid out in the GMP guideline and that you now see before you on the screen. We'll first look at premises, then equipment, then personnel, then quality assurance, then sanitation program, operations, specifications, stability, samples, records, and recall recording. We're not covering in the training session sterile products or homeopathic medicines. We will, however, just briefly comment on these two and say that with respect to sterile products, you're required to comply with the proper drug GMPs, not simply the NHP GMPs. In the case of homeopathic medicine, there's a special annex to the NHP GMPs which you must comply with. However, everything we discuss in this presentation will apply to homeopathic medicines.